And as we abstained from overseas meddling, American civilization flourished, and America became the world's economic powerhouse. This non-interventionist America, devoted to solving our own problems and nurturing our own distinctive civilization, soon became stupor mundi, the Latin phrase, the wonder of the world. Everywhere, people struggling for their freedom looked for inspiration and hope to the great republic of the West. America served the cause of freedom in lands across the seas, not by sending troops or bombers or foreign aid, but by being, in the words of Henry Clay, a light to all nations, the shining example of a happy and prosperous people enjoying their God-given rights and peace. When the French decided, pardon me, to send us a birthday present for our country's 100th birthday, the statue was named Liberty Enlightening the World. That's the reason that statue in New York Harbor is carrying a torch. Traditional American policy thought it was none of our business to make any distinction between foreign nations as to their morality, ideology, or provenance. If a regime had the attributes of a state, we recognized it and dealt with it. There were no outlaw states or rogue states. We carried on business with the governments ranging from the Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Russia to England and France. By the end of the 19th century, however, a great transformation took place in the official American policy towards the rest of the world. The country's elite went over to a policy of global responsibility, which meant more and more our intrusion into other nations' affairs, backed up by a growing U.S. military might. The landmarks along the road are the Spanish-American War, the conquest of the Philippines under William McKinley, then Theodore Roosevelt's noisy promotion of the United States as a great power, and I don't understand why that man is on Mount Rushmore. If you look carefully, or I could mention another American president who maybe shouldn't be there. But if you look carefully, I think you'll see Jefferson sort of leering at him. But Theodore Roosevelt promoted a great American naval power, and most faithful of all, Woodrow Wilson, who embroiled us in the First World War. Establishment historians like to give the impression that all of these steps were inevitable, just as they claim that the massive expansion of government power at home has been preordained and inevitable by the modern world or technology or whatever. But in fact, every move away from America first and towards globalism was the result of political choice and political struggle. The best example is the turn of the century, where the imperialism of McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt was fought tooth and nail by the classical liberals of the time. Men like Edward Atkinson of Boston, Carl Schurz, pardon me, E.L. Godkin, editor of The Nation magazine, which in those days was the premier laissez-faire journal in this country, believe it or not, by Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, and William Graham Sumner, about whom I'll have something to say more further at the end of this talk. But the libertarians of the day proved to be no match for the forces arrayed against them. The civilian and military bureaucrats in Washington, the capitalist interests anxious for government backing for their export trade and investments abroad, and more than anything else, the elite political class enthralled by their vision of America as a mighty world power. The decisive turn came with Woodrow Wilson and World War I. Wilson presented the nation with the starkest possible contrast to our traditional policy. For over a century, the American attitude was the one expressed by John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams was Secretary of State under James Monroe and the author of the Monroe Doctrine. John Quincy Adams declared, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be America's heart, her benediction, and her prayers. But America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Instead of acting as a light to all nations, America, in Woodrow Wilson's conception, would scour the earth in search of anti-democratic monsters to destroy. The all-knowing leaders in Washington would discover them and then tap the immense resources of our free enterprise wealth machine. And that's the advantage they've had, and that's why they've made America the world hegemonic power. It's because of what capitalism produce in America, and the politicians take what they need for it. This would be an endless crusade to rid the world of evil and impose democracy on everyone else. Wilson was rejecting the authentic American tradition. In its place, he was adopting the program of the Jacobins in the French Revolution. They were the men who tried to impose their ideals, allegedly of liberty, equality, and fraternity, on the rest of Europe at the point of a bayonet. The results were 25 years of war, that only ended at Waterloo, millions of dead and devastation across the continent. Wilson's experiment in exporting democracy turned out badly as well. By pushing our way into Europe's bloody quarrel, we ensured that there would be no compromise peace, and instead the total triumph of one side. The consequence was the vindictive Treaty of Versailles, virtually guaranteeing another world war. The Germans were forced to give up the Kaiser, which made it possible 14 years later for a demagogue like Hitler to seize total power, with the terrible consequences that ensued. That was democracy in action. You know, the Italians, after the First World War, kept their king. Of course, they were a victorious power. And then finally, when the time came and Italy was totally humbled by Mussolini's stupid policy, the king dismissed Mussolini. He was in a position to do it. No one was in a position to dismiss Hitler. Mr. Wilson's war, as it was called, demonstrated the high costs at home of exporting democracy abroad. In every area of American life, Americans lost liberties to Washington as taxes and public debt reached unprecedented levels, as government controls pervaded the economy, and the authority of federal agents and federal censors reached into every city and town. In 1920, the people voted in a landslide for a return to normalcy under Warren Harding, whom historians, of course, count as one of our worst presidents. But the transformation of law, institutions, and most of all the attitudes and mentality of the people could not be undone. The Second World War is the next great landmark on our road to permanent war. This whole complicated issue has been reduced to simply one word: Hitler. Of course, Hitler was an extremely evil man, one of history's worst. But in all this talk about the war to rid the world of Hitler, what is rarely mentioned is that the United States was the faithful ally of Joseph Stalin, who killed more people and killed them earlier than Hitler did. Also, not usually mentioned, is the fact that Franklin Roosevelt lied and maneuvered the country into war. This is hardly the mark of a great democratic statesman, one might think. But Roosevelt's defenders have an answer. This is very typical of them nowadays. This is the way a pro-Roosevelt historian, Robert Dallek of UCLA, put it in a major work on Roosevelt's foreign policy.